The tunnel smelled like wet stone and old rust, the way the world smelled now, damp and forgotten, pressed in on all sides by a darkness that never fully retreated no matter how many lead strips the engineers strung along the ceiling. Mara had lived underground for 11 of her 17 years, and she had long since stopped mourning the sun in the way that the older survivors did, with that particular hollowness behind the eyes, that flinching when someone mentioned open sky. She had other things to mourn. She had learned to mourn in smaller, quieter ways. She was crouched beside the water recycling unit on level 4 when she found the first document. It was not supposed to be there. Most things that mattered, Mara had discovered, were not supposed to be where she found them. The recycling unit occupied a cramped alcove behind the eastern mess hall, and she had crawled in through the maintenance hatch because the pressure gauge had been reading wrong for 3 days and nobody else had gotten around to fixing it. She was like that. She fixed things before she was asked to, partly because the engineers appreciated it and partly because fixing things gave her hands something to do while her mind ran its usual circuits of worry and restlessness. The document was wedged between the unit's housing and the raw stone of the tunnel wall, folded into quarters and sealed with a strip of clear tape that had yellowed and curled at the edges. Someone had put it there deliberately. Someone had hidden it. She could tell because the fold was too precise, the tape too intentional. This was not something that had slipped from a pocket. This was something that had been placed. She almost didn't open it. She told herself that later, when she was trying to decide whether everything that followed was her fault. She almost tucked it back where she'd found it and finished with the pressure gauge and climbed back out and gone on with her day. But she was 17 and curious and alone in a narrow alcove with stone pressing in from every side, and the document had a word on its front that she could read even through the yellowed tape. The word was Genesis. She opened it. It was a printout, the kind that came from the old inkjet printers the archivist level still maintained, 12 pages of dense single-space text with headers and footnote markers and the watermark of an institution she didn't recognize, something called the Subterranean Studies Consortium, with a logo that looked like a cross-section of the Earth's layers rendered in faded blue ink. The date at the top was 2019. 12 years ago, 2 years before the emergence. She read the first paragraph standing in the alcove with her head bent to one side to fit under the pipe housing, and then she sat down on the cold stone floor and read the rest of it with her knees pulled to her chest and her heart doing something strange and unsteady in her ribcage. The document was a research summary. A confidential one, clearly. The word confidential was stamped in red across the top of every page, though the red had faded to a rusty orange that looked uncomfortably like old blood. It summarized findings from a drilling project in the Mariana Basin, one of several deep-bore initiatives that had been running quietly through the 2010s under the auspices of various governments and energy consortiums. The findings were, to use the document's own language, anomalous. The findings were, to use Mara's language, impossible. At 4.5 kilometers below the ocean floor, in a stratum of rock that geological models said should be nothing but compressed silicate and trace mineral deposits, the drilling equipment had encountered hollow chambers. Not one. Not a natural cave system of the kind that occasionally surprised geologists. Hundreds of chambers, interconnected, clearly shaped being the word the document circled back to again and again with the anxious repetition of people who could not quite bring themselves to say what they meant. Shaped. Geometrically regular. With walls that bore markings. She read that sentence 3 times. With walls that bore markings. The document was careful after that. Clinical. It described the markings in technical language, repeating geometric units, potential load-bearing structural elements, evidence of deliberate surface treatment suggesting heat application or chemical processing. It did not say writing. It did not say architecture. It did not say civilization. But between every careful clinical line, in the white space where the document's authors had clearly argued with themselves about how much to put in writing, Mara could feel those words pressing outward like something trying to surface. The last 2 pages were different from the first 10. The first 10 were calm, measured, professional. The last 2 had been written by someone who was frightened. She could tell by the way the sentences got shorter, by the way the footnotes stopped, by the paragraph near the end that simply said, in plain language stripped of all the careful scientific hedging, "We recommend immediate cessation of all deep-bore drilling operations worldwide pending full assessment of what we have found and what it may mean for our understanding of Earth's geological and biological history. We further recommend that findings be kept from public disclosure until the implications have been fully considered, as premature release could cause significant societal disruption." And then, in the margin of the last page, handwritten in blue ink, in letters that slanted with urgency, "They know we're here. They have known for decades." The drilling woke something that was already awake. Mara sat on the floor of the maintenance alcove for a long time after she finished reading. The pressure gauge ticked. Somewhere in the tunnel system, A ventilation fan cycled on and ran for 30 seconds and then cycled off. Water dripped somewhere in the middle distance with the patient rhythm of a metronome keeping time for a piece of music no one had written yet. She fixed the pressure gauge. She tucked the document inside her jacket against her ribs where it crinkled slightly with each breath. And then she climbed out of the alcove and walked back toward the central hub of Shelter 11 with the careful, unhurried gait of someone who was not carrying anything that mattered, and all the while the document crinkled against her heart and she thought about what it would mean if it was real. Shelter 11 was one of 43 known shelters in what had been the eastern part of North America. 43 was the official number. People whispered about others, shelters that had gone dark, shelters that had been found, shelters that had never quite finished being built when the emergence came and made the surface uninhabitable in the space of 8 months. 43 was the number that the council broadcast over the emergency frequency every week along with a status report that was always essentially the same. We are here, we are surviving, do not attempt to reach the surface. The emergence had begun in October of 2021, which meant that Mara had been 6 years old when the world ended. She remembered very little of it directly, a few vivid shards of memory, mostly sensory, the sound of sirens, the weight of her mother's hand on her head, the specific smell of the duffel bag they had packed with 3 days of food and a change of clothes each, and her father's good knife and the tablet with the offline maps and the coordinates that her father had gotten from someone he trusted at work, someone in a department whose name he wouldn't say. And those coordinates had led them here. To Shelter 11, which had been under construction for 4 years before anyone was supposed to need it. Her father was dead now. He had died in the 2nd year, when a section of Tunnel 14 had collapsed during a re-engineering attempt. Her mother was alive. Her mother ran the water treatment facility on Level 6 and had the kind of competence that kept her too busy to grieve for more than small pockets of time, and Mara loved her in the way you love people who hold things together through sheer force of will, with an admiration that had gradually, quietly replaced the simpler love of childhood. The shelter was home to just over 2,000 people. It had been designed for 1,500, and the extra 500 showed everywhere. In the extended mess hall that now ran the full length of Tunnel 7, in the sleeping quarters where the bunks had been tripled up along walls that were originally meant to hold singles, in the slight permanent edge of tension in the air that came from people living too close together for too long without adequate private space. The engineers had done remarkable things. The hydroponics bays on Level 2 produced enough vegetables to supplement the sealed protein stocks with something that approximated freshness. The geothermal tap on Level 8 ran reliable power. The schools on Level 3 educated the children, including Mara's younger brother Eli, who was 10 and had never been above ground and sometimes asked questions about it with a directness that could silence a room. 2,000 people had made their own world down here. They had their own politics and their own gossip and their own small rituals of community. They had a weekly film screening in the central hub, projecting old movies onto the smooth section of tunnel wall that someone had painted white for exactly that purpose. They had a garden on Level 2 that was technically part of the hydroponics infrastructure but that people treated as a park, a few benches, a climbing structure for the small children, some flowering plants grown from seeds that someone had thought to bring. They had arguments and romances and pregnancies and funerals. They had, in the way that humans always managed, built something recognizable in the ruins of what they'd lost. And they had, woven through all of this, a story. A single story, the one that explained everything, the one that was told in schools and repeated in council broadcasts and never seriously questioned because questioning it served no one and cost too much. The story was this: creatures from space had come to Earth. They had come in 2021, arriving through a mechanism that was not fully understood, not ships, exactly, not anything that matched the science fiction that had spent a century imagining first contact. They had come from beneath the ocean surface and from within the deep crust, emerging through vents and fissures in a coordinated global event that had taken place across 6 days in October. They had been hostile. They had taken the surface. Humans had fled underground and the creatures, which people called the Dherath, a word that had come from somewhere, from the garbled transmissions of the earliest days, though no one could say precisely from where or from what language, had claimed what remained above. Mara had believed this story her entire life. She had never had reason not to. The Dherath had come and they had taken the Earth and humans were underground now. That was simply the shape of the world. She walked back to her bunk on Level 3 with a document against her ribs, and she lay down on the thin mattress and stared at the ceiling, and she thought about a single word in the document's opening paragraph that she had read quickly at first and returned to as she walked back through the tunnel, turning it over in her mind like a stone in a river. The word was indigenous. She found Jonas in the archive room the next morning, which was where Jonas usually was. Jonas was 63 years old, which made him one of the older residents of Shelter 11, and he had been a geologist before the emergence, a specific kind of geologist who worked in a specific subdiscipline that he described as paleogeological systems analysis, which meant, as he had explained to Mara when she was 12 and pestering him with questions during a school archive project, that he had spent his career studying how deep the patterns went. Not just the rock. The patterns in the rock. The ways that geological formations implied histories stretching back not millions but billions of years, and what those histories said about the nature of the planet itself. He was a small, precise man with thick white eyebrows that moved independently of each other when he talked, and he had been Mara's mentor since she was 12 in the informal way that certain things in the shelter became official through pure practice and repetition. He taught her to read geological maps. He taught her the principles of structural engineering as they applied to underground construction. He taught her to fix things, which was why she had been in the maintenance alcove and had found the document, which was something she would think about later, the strange retroactive logic of the chain of small events that led to larger ones. She locked the archive room door behind her. It was a heavy door, reinforced steel, designed to protect the physical document collection. The shelter had books, real paper books, several thousand of them, considered among the shelter's most valuable resources. The lock made a sound like a held breath releasing. Jonas looked up from the table where he was cataloguing seed packets, because in addition to everything else he managed the seed archive for the hydroponics bays. He looked at her face and his white eyebrows drew together. "Sit down," he said, before she had spoken a word. She put the document on the table between them. She watched him read it. It took him longer than it had taken her. He read slowly, the way people read when they're reading for the second time even though it's the first time their eyes have seen the words, with recognition, with a particular stillness of someone whose worst suspicion is being confirmed. When he finished he set the document down and he did not look at her immediately. He looked at the seed packets, at the neat rows of labeled envelopes, at his own hands on the table. "Where did you find this?" he said. She told him. He nodded, as if the answer confirmed something. "I've been looking for that for 11 years, he said. "I left it there in 2022 when I thought I was going to be called before the Council Security Committee and I needed somewhere it wouldn't be found on my person. And then the committee never came and I couldn't bring myself to go back for it. It felt safer where it was. Some things are safer buried." "You knew," she said. She did not make it an accusation. Her voice came out very flat, which was what happened to her voice when she was trying to keep it from doing something else. "I wrote the annotations," he said. "In the margin." She looked at him for a long moment. He was 63 and he had the kind of face that had lived long enough in its own skin to settle into an expression of resignation that was not quite despair, something more functional than despair, something that had made its peace with the weight it carried and learned to walk with it. "Tell me what you know," she said. And he did. It took most of the morning. What Jonas knew was this. He had been part of a research consortium, the Subterranean Studies Consortium named in the document's watermark, that had operated from 2014 to 2021, funded quietly by a coalition of energy corporations and 3 national science foundations, ostensibly to study geothermal energy potential. The consortium had found what the document described and more besides. They had found it in the Mariana Basin and they had found similar formations in the Ural deep-bore sites and in the drilling projects off the coast of Greenland and in 6 locations in the continental crust beneath what had been the Pacific Northwest. The formations were not natural. That had been the conclusion after 2 years of analysis, concluded privately and never published. They were architectural. They were vast. And they were old in a way that simply did not fit any existing model of Earth's history, not old in the way that ancient human cities were old, not thousands of years old, but old in geological terms, layered into strata that had formed over tens of millions of years, suggesting not just longevity but integration, a civilization that had not merely lasted a long time but had become, over deep time, inseparable from the planet's crust itself. The Dherath, and Jonas flinched slightly when she used that word, which she noted, were not aliens. They were not from space. The narrative of extraterrestrial invasion had been constructed in the earliest days of the emergence, deliberately and with great efficiency, because the alternative, the truth, would have made the catastrophe not just a disaster but a moral reckoning of a kind that humans, pressed into survival mode, could not have withstood. The truth was that the Dherath were Earth's original inhabitants. They had been here, in the deep structures of the planet, for longer than multicellular life had existed on the surface. They had watched, from below, the entire history of surface life play out above them, the Cambrian explosion, the great extinctions, the slow stumble of evolution toward complexity. They had, apparently, not interfered. Jonas's voice went very quiet here, and he looked at his hands again. They had not interfered, he said, until humans began to drill. The Industrial Revolution had been, from the perspective of the deep interior, a kind of distant percussion, vibration, heat leakage, minor disruption. Tolerable. The 20th century had been louder. The great acceleration of extraction after World War II, the oil wells, the mineral mines, the deep water drilling, the geothermal taps, had been louder still. The consortium's own projects, the ones Jonas had participated in, had been in the exact zones that the Dherath's innermost habitations occupied. They had not come from space. They had come up. They were defending their home, Mara said. Jonas was quiet for a moment. From their perspective, yes. Almost certainly. From any perspective, she said, and her voice was careful, and she felt herself being very precise about what she meant, because she understood that this was one of those moments where what you said next would matter in ways you couldn't fully see yet. From any perspective, Jonas. They were defending their home. We drilled into their cities. For 100 years we were drilling into their cities and their roads and their, whatever they had. We were punching holes through their world. We were extracting the materials their civilization was built from. I know. And nobody, the Council, when they built this story about alien invaders. The Council didn't know the full picture. Or some of them didn't. Others, he stopped. The document you found is 11 years old. There are things I've learned since then. Pieces. You find information in unexpected places, underground, when you have decades to look and the people who once kept secrets lose track of why they're keeping them. He stood up and went to the shelves along the east wall, the ones that held the geological survey maps, and he pulled a flat folder from the third shelf and brought it to the table. Inside the folder were 9 more documents. Smaller ones, some handwritten, some printed. She read them all. What they said, collectively, added up to something she could barely hold in her mind in its entirety. The Dherath had tried to communicate before the emergence. For 20 years before 2021, they had sent signals, vibrations in specific frequencies through the crust, responses to the drilling activity, attempts at something that could be interpreted as warning or greeting or both simultaneously. Seismologists had detected anomalous readings for decades. Several researchers had flagged them. The flags had been ignored or suppressed, because the readings were inconvenient and the drilling was profitable. There had been one genuine attempt at contact, in 2018, through a research team in the Greenland facility. A young geoacoustic specialist had believed she was decoding a pattern in the subcrust vibrations. She had prepared a report. The report had been classified and the geoacoustic specialist had been reassigned and the drilling had continued. In October of 2021, the Dherath had stopped trying to communicate. Where is she now? Mara asked. The geoacoustic specialist. Jonas looked at her. His white eyebrows settled into something that was not quite sorrow and not quite guilt but occupied the space between them. She's here, he said. She's been here since the beginning. He paused. Her name is Dr. Reyes. She runs the geology survey team. Mara sat back. Dr. Reyes was a compact, serious woman of about 50 who taught one of the advanced sciences electives and who had a habit of staring at the tunnel walls with an expression that Mara had always interpreted as concentration. She had, Mara realized now, the look of someone who was always listening to something that nobody else could hear. She went to Dr. Reyes that afternoon. She did not tell her about the document. She started with a different approach. She said she was working on an independent study project, which was true enough, and she asked if she could look at the geological survey maps for the region around Shelter 11, specifically the deep strata readings that the survey team had been collecting. Dr. Reyes looked at her for a long moment with those listening eyes. Then she said, Jonas told you. It was not a question. He showed me some documents, Mara said carefully. Did he show you the Greenland report? Yes. Dr. Reyes sat down at her workbench with the slow deliberateness of someone lowering themselves into cold water. She was quiet for a moment, and in that quiet Mara could hear the ventilation system and the distant sound of water in the pipes and something else, lower, below all of that, a vibration in the floor, constant and very faint, like the heartbeat of something enormous and patient. She had always heard it. She had thought it was the geothermal system. You hear it, Dr. Reyes said, watching her face. Is that them? It's been them for 11 years. Dr. Reyes looked at the floor. They're still here. Obviously they're still here. This is their planet. But what I mean is, they're still signaling. Not to us, or not exactly to us. I've spent 11 years thinking about this. I think it's just what they do. I think it's how they communicate with each other. But if you listen, if you know what you're listening for, there are patterns in it. There are the same repeating patterns I found in 2018 in Greenland. The same ones. She paused. I think they're still trying to communicate. Yes. Mara was quiet for a moment, feeling the vibration through the soles of her boots, trying to feel it as language, as intention, as something that came from a being with a home and a history and a grievance that was also, she was beginning to understand, a legitimate grievance. Does anyone else know about what they really are? A handful. Jonas. Myself. 2 members of the original engineering team. And now you. Dr. Reyes looked at her steadily. The council knows what they decide to know. There were council members, in the early years, who had access to the original research. They chose the narrative they chose because the truth, she stopped and started again. The truth would have meant asking people who were already in survival mode, already terrified, already grieving enormous losses, to simultaneously reckon with the fact that the catastrophe was, at least in part, a consequence of what humans had done. It would have meant grief of a completely different kind. The complicated kind. The kind where you're not sure you're the victim. But we are the victim, Mara said, and heard herself, and heard the way it sounded, and felt something shift in her chest. I mean, people died. My father died. Millions of people died. We lost the surface. We've been underground for 11 years. Her voice remained level, but something behind it was not. Saying that we also caused it doesn't mean none of that is real. No, Dr. Reyes agreed. No, it doesn't. Both things are true. Both things have been true from the beginning. That's the part that's so hard to hold. It's not that one is true and the other isn't. It's that both are, entirely. They sat together in the quiet geology lab, with the vibration of the deep earth moving through the stone beneath them, and Mara thought about her father's hand on her shoulder the last morning she had seen him, and she thought about the document's clinical description of architectural chambers and geometric markings, a civilization pressed into the bones of the planet, and she thought about what it meant to have a home, and what it meant to have it violated so slowly, so systematically, that by the time you responded it was too late to explain yourself to the people your response had killed. She thought about whether explanation would have made a difference. She thought it probably would not have, at the time. She thought that might be true in both directions. She did not know what to do with what she knew. This was, she understood, the position that Jonas and Dr. Reyes had occupied for 11 years, and the reason they had not done anything with it, not because they lacked the courage or the will, but because there was genuinely no clear action to take. You could not undo the emergence. You could not restore the surface or return the dead or reach the Dherath to offer an apology that would, in any case, need to be accompanied by something material, and the only material thing available was gone. You could tell people. That was an option. Go to the council, make the document public, force the reckoning that had been deferred for 11 years. She spent 3 days considering it. She moved through her daily life in Shelter 11 with the secret pressing against her like the document had pressed against her ribs, physically present, constantly felt. She ate in the mess hall and watched people talk and laugh over their reconstituted soup and looked at their faces with a new awareness that she found both illuminating and painful. These were people who had built a life down here, a real one, with all the texture and difficulty and occasional unexpected joy that real lives contained. She watched Eli sit with his friends at the children's table and make them laugh with some piece of physical comedy, his thin arms windmilling, and she felt the familiar love for him sharpened now by the specific knowledge that he had never been above ground and would not go above ground for years at minimum, perhaps ever, and that this was both a catastrophe and not entirely a simple one. She found herself, on the second day, in the hydroponics bay on level 2, the one that functioned as a park, sitting on one of the benches near the flowering plants. The plants were small and determined-looking, lavender, and something that might have been a dwarf variety of cosmos, purple-pink, pressing toward the lead lights above them with a tropism that looked, from a certain angle, like hope. The small children from the level 3 school played on the climbing structure nearby, making the noise that children made in all circumstances, which was a noise composed in roughly equal parts of delight and grievance. A little boy climbed to the top of the climbing structure and stood there with his arms out and his face turned up toward the lights. He was maybe 4 years old, small and round-cheeked, and he was grinning at the ceiling lights as if they were the sun. As if this was enough. As if this narrow substitution, this pale technological echo of the real thing, was sufficient to sustain the impulse to stretch upward, to reach for something. She thought about the markings on the walls of the Dherath chambers, 4.5 kilometers below the ocean floor. She thought about what it might mean to build something beautiful so deep underground that no other species had ever seen it. She thought about whether the Dherath had children, and whether those children played, and whether they were, in whatever sense was meaningful to them, still doing so. She thought about the word indigenous. About what it meant for a species to be native to a place in the deepest possible sense, not just to live there but to be made of it, to have evolved over millions of years in such intimate relationship with the planet's interior that the distinction between the civilization and the geology became unclear. She thought about what humans had been on the surface, also indigenous, in their own way, also made of the place they had come from, also possessed of a history they had not fully understood. Two indigenous species, sharing a single planet, occupying different levels of it, and the catastrophe that had occurred when they finally became aware of each other. On the third day she went back to Jonas. "I want to try to contact them," she said. Jonas looked at her with the expression she had learned over years meant he was taking her seriously. Not the expression that meant he thought she was wrong. The one that meant he saw where she was going and was going to walk alongside it for a while before he said anything. "Dr. Reyes thinks the frequency patterns are still present," she said. "She's been recording them for 11 years. She has 11 years of data. And she was the closest anyone got to decoding them in 2018. She was close, she told me. She was close before they shut her down." Mara leaned forward. "She has better equipment now than she had in Greenland. We have the geological survey instruments. We have the seismic monitors. We have 11 years of her own recordings. And we have," she paused, "time. We're underground. We're not going anywhere. We have time to try." "To what end?" Jonas asked, not as a challenge but as a real question, the kind he always asked, the kind that required a real answer. "I don't know," she said honestly. "I don't know what contact would look like or whether it's possible or what we'd say or what they'd say. But Dr. Reyes thinks they're still signaling, which means they haven't given up entirely. Which means there might still be something to reach." She looked at her hands on the table. "And also, even if we can't reach them. Even if we try and we can't. Telling people the truth about what they are. What we are. What happened." She looked up. "It matters. Doesn't it? Even if it changes nothing practical about our survival. It matters what story we tell about ourselves." Jonas was quiet for a long time. The archive room was very still, the books ranked along the shelves in their careful order, the seed packets in their rows, the geological maps in their flat folders, all the collected evidence of what humans knew about the world they had lost and the world they now occupied. "Yes," he said, at last. "It matters." It took another month before she was ready. She spent that month working with Dr. Reyes every evening after her regular duties, learning the pattern analysis methodology, learning to read the seismic data as something other than geological noise. It was extraordinarily difficult work. The signals were subtle and embedded in the background vibration of the planet in a way that required a particular quality of attention. Not focused, exactly, but calibrated, like learning to hear a specific instrument in a full orchestra. There were moments when she thought she had it and then lost it again, when the pattern resolved and then dissolved back into the noise, when what she'd thought was signal turned out to be the shelter's own geothermal systems reverberating through the stone. But there were also moments, more of them as the weeks went on, when it was clear. When the pattern was there, unmistakable, complex and structured and purposeful, running through the rock beneath them with the persistence of something that had been going on for a very long time and intended to keep going. She brought her findings to the council on the 40th day. She had not asked permission. She had simply sent a formal request for time on the council agenda, and they had given it to her because she was known, in the shelter, as someone who fixed things, and the council generally respected people who fix things. She went in with the documents, the original one from the maintenance alcove, the 9 from Jonas's archive folder, and 3 new ones that Dr. Reyes had compiled from her own records, and she presented them. Jonas sat in the back of the meeting room. Dr. Reyes sat beside her at the front. Eli sat in the middle rows, because she had told him she was presenting something important and he had asked to come and she had said yes, because he was 10 and he lived here and he deserved to know the shape of the world he had been born into. The council was 7 people. They listened without interrupting, which was unusual and which she read, correctly, as a sign that what she was saying was landing differently than routine business. She presented the geological evidence first, because it was the most verifiable, the hardest to dismiss. She presented the historical record, the drilling projects, the classified reports, the suppressed communications, the 2018 Greenland research. She explained what Dr. Reyes had found and what it meant. She played a recording. Dr. Reyes had spent 3 weeks rendering the subcrust signal into audible frequencies, and the result was not exactly music but was not music either, a deep repeating pattern with variations, structural and somehow communicative in a way that bypassed explanation and spoke directly to something in the chest, something that recognized pattern recognition as a fundamental act of contact. When the recording finished there was silence in the room. The head of the council was a woman named Asha Okone, who had been a city planner before the emergence and who ran the shelter with a kind of methodical humanity that Mara had always admired. She was looking at the floor, the way people looked when they were not seeing what was in front of them but something inside themselves. "You're saying," Asha said, slowly, "that they were here first?" "Yes. And that what we did to their habitat, the drilling, the extraction, constituted, from their perspective, an invasion of their home territory?" "Yes." The council member on Asha's left, a man named Bertrand who managed the shelter's fuel resources and who had always struck Mara as somewhat combative, said, "That doesn't justify what they did to us. Millions of people." "No," Mara said. "It doesn't justify it. I'm not saying it justifies it. I'm saying, if someone was systematically destroying your home, drilling through your walls, extracting the materials your civilization needed to survive, for 100 years, and you had tried to communicate and been ignored, and then you stopped them by force," she paused. "Justification isn't the right frame. But understanding is. And we can't even begin to think about what comes next, whether that's coexistence, whether that's negotiation, whether that's anything, if we're working from a story that tells us they are alien invaders when they are actually people defending their home from us." The word people landed in the room and she felt everyone register it. Bertrand said, "We don't know that they're people. We know they build. We know they communicate. We know they have been here for tens of millions of years." She looked at him steadily. "How long does someone have to be somewhere before it becomes their home?" The silence after that lasted a long time. The council did not vote that day. They convened 3 more sessions over the following 2 weeks, and Mara and Dr. Reyes and Jonas were present at all of them, along with 3 other shelter residents who had been quietly gathering related evidence for years and had come forward when word of Mara's presentation spread through the shelter in the way that important things spread through a community of 2,000 people who shared walls and air and the particular intimacy of a closed system. It was a woman named Priya who made the argument that shifted things. Priya was 35 and had been a philosopher. She had been working on a doctoral dissertation on environmental ethics when the emergence happened, and the particular irony of that was not lost on her, and she said, in the 3rd council session, that the question was not whether the truth was comfortable or politically stable but whether the shelter's children had the right to know the world they had inherited. She looked directly at Eli when she said it, because Eli had been sitting in the same chair in the middle rows at all 3 sessions, listening with the concentrated attention of a 10-year-old who has been told that something important is happening and has decided to take that seriously. "These children," Priya said, "will be the ones who ultimately negotiate whatever comes next. Whether that happens in 10 years or 50 or 100. And the story they carry into that negotiation will determine what's possible." She paused. "If they carry the story that the Dherath are alien invaders, they will carry it as people defending themselves against an incomprehensible enemy. If they carry the truth, they will carry it as people trying to find a way to share a planet with its original inhabitants. Those are different children. Those are different negotiations." Asha Okone called the vote after that. It was 5-2. Bertrand and 1 other member voted against. The 5 who voted for it did so with the look of people who were setting down something heavy and picking up something heavier, because the truth was heavier than the lie had been, and they knew it, and they were doing it anyway. The announcement went out on the emergency frequency 2 days later, in Asha's voice, reading from a text that Mara and Jonas and Dr. Reyes and Priya had worked on together for 18 hours straight, getting every sentence as honest and as careful as they could make it. Mara listened to it from the level 2 garden, sitting on the bench near the flowering plants. The announcement played through the shelter's PA system, Asha's voice moving through the tunnels, filling every level. Mara heard it with her eyes closed and her hands folded in her lap, feeling the faint vibration through the bench beneath her, the deep signal from below, patient and persistent and ongoing. The announcement did not end with hope, exactly. It was not that kind of document. It acknowledged what had been lost and what had been done and what those 2 things had to do with each other, and it acknowledged the difficulty of holding both of them at once. It said that the shelter would begin a formal program of signal research, working with Dr. Reyes to attempt a response in kind, to try to answer, in whatever way was possible, the communication that had been attempting to reach them for decades. It said this might take years and might not succeed. It said it was worth attempting. When it finished, the shelter was quiet in a way that was different from usual quiet. 2,000 people absorbing something and not yet knowing what to do with it. Mara sat with the quiet and the vibration and the small determined flowers pressing toward their artificial light. After a while Eli came and sat beside her. He had heard the announcement on level 3 and come straight here, which meant he had run most of the way, because his shoes were not quite properly tied and there was the faint breathlessness of recent running in his voice when he said, Is it true? Yes, she said. He thought about this for a moment. So they were here first. Much longer than us. And we, people drilled into their, he frowned, searching for the right word. Into their stuff. Into their civilization. Yes. He was quiet for a longer moment. His 10-year-old face worked through things with a seriousness that she had always loved in him, the quality he had of not looking for permission to take things seriously. That doesn't mean what they did was okay, he said. No. It doesn't. But it changes it. Yes. It changes it. He nodded. He looked at the flowers. He looked at the ceiling lights. He looked at the floor, and she knew he was thinking about what was below it, not just rock, not just the geothermal system, not just the infrastructure that kept them alive, but something older and vaster and more complex than any of the stories he had been given so far about the world. Are we going to talk to them? He said. We're going to try. He nodded again, slowly, with the gravity of someone receiving a significant task. Okay, he said. He leaned slightly against her side, the way he still did sometimes though he was 10 and mostly past the age of doing it, and she put her arm around him and felt the vibration of the deep earth moving through the bench, through the stone, through both of them at once. They sat there together, two children of the surface, underground in the dark, listening. The first signal went out 6 weeks later, on a Tuesday morning, through a transducer array that Dr. Reyes had spent 5 weeks building from components cannibalized from the seismic monitoring network and 3 pieces of equipment that had been sitting in a supply room in Level 8 since the shelter was built, originally intended for a deep-bore geothermal tap that had never been completed. The signal was a response, as close a response as they could construct, to one of the repeating patterns in the Dherath communication, rendered back into the subcrust frequency range through the transducer array and sent downward through the bedrock beneath the shelter. Mara was present. Jonas was present. Dr. Reyes ran the equipment with her jaw set and her eyes very focused, and when she initiated the transmission she did so without ceremony, pressing a single key and then sitting back and waiting. They waited for 4 days. On the morning of the 5th day, the seismic monitors showed an anomalous reading in the frequency range directly below the shelter, not general, not diffuse as the background signal was, but localized, precise, pointed upward. Like something looking up. Dr. Reyes played the recording back 3 times. The 3rd time through, she covered her mouth with her hand. That's a response pattern, she said, very quietly. They modified the signal. They changed one element of it. She looked at the monitor. That's what you do when you're trying to, that's call and response. That's the basic structure of, she stopped. She turned to Mara. Her eyes were very bright in her worn face. They answered. Mara sat down. She sat down because her legs needed her to, and she put her hands on her knees, and she felt the vibration through the floor, through the chair, through everything, and she understood that the vibration had always been there and would continue to be there, that it was the oldest thing in the room by a margin so vast as to make the word old feel insufficient, and that it was also, possibly, the beginning of something. Not resolution. She did not tell herself it was resolution. Too many people had died for resolution to be the word. Too much had been lost on both sides, or whatever loss meant to a civilization built into the bones of a planet, she didn't know enough to say. But beginning was a real word. Beginning was honest. She thought about her father and the specific weight of his hand on her head the last morning she had seen him. She thought about the drilling rigs and the classified reports and the young geoacoustic specialist who had tried to tell someone and been reassigned. She thought about the October days of 2021, the planet split open from below, and whether those days had been an act of war or an act of defense or both simultaneously, the way a word can mean 2 things at once and the meaning depends entirely on where you're standing. She thought about a civilization that had spent millions of years in the deep dark, in the architecture of the world's own bones, pressing patterns into stone walls that no surface creature had ever seen, communicating in frequencies below the threshold of human hearing, patient beyond any human reckoning with patience, persisting. She thought about what it would mean to share a planet honestly, with full knowledge of its history, with the weight of that history accepted and carried rather than buried. She did not know if it was possible. She thought it might be. She thought the possibility was worth being serious about, worth dedicating what remained of her life to, worth being wrong about and trying again. She thought that the worst thing that could happen was also the thing that had already happened, which meant that the direction from here was not nothing. Eli would grow up knowing the true shape of the world. The children in the Level 3 school would grow up knowing it. And when they eventually, in 10 years or 50 or 100, she did not know, when they eventually encountered the question of what the surface of this shared planet might look like for both its peoples, they would come to that question already carrying the knowledge that two indigenous civilizations had been here together all along, each unaware of the other for most of history, aware of each other now, trying. That was not a happy ending. She had stopped expecting happy endings at some point in the last 6 weeks, and she did not mourn them. But it was a real one. It was the kind of ending that was also a beginning, which was the only kind worth working toward. Below them, deep in the ancient stone, the signal pulsed and waited. She leaned forward in her chair and put her hands on the seismic monitor housing and felt it beneath her palms, the steady, old, patient rhythm of something alive in the dark, and she thought, "We hear you." She thought it clearly, as if thinking it clearly enough might make it travel. "We hear you. We're sorry. We're here." The lights hummed overhead. The ventilation cycled. Somewhere distant in the shelter a child laughed at something, the sound carrying through the tunnels in the way that all sounds carried here, bouncing off stone walls, arriving from every direction at once. Mara closed her eyes and listened.